There's a tendency for progressives or populists to lay the blame of neoliberalism at the feet of a couple of politicians or a political party. In the US, you've got Ronald Reagan, in the UK, you've got Margaret Thatcher. The narrative being sold is that the good things were stripped away by a few individual politicians, and the result was all of the bad things we experience today. This kind of return to olden days but left wing is kind of what Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn tried to get at. This is a very pervasive way of thinking about politics. It's one where we psychoanalyze individual politicians and base our ideologies around them. This is also very shallow. Sure, Reagan and Thatcher were from conservative political parties. It's expected they like lower taxes or private enterprise. Yet Bob Hawke, Roger Douglas and Olof Palme were all from left-wing political parties and enacted very similar reforms. Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, the respective Democrat and Labour leaders that came after their conservative counterparts, also embraced neoliberalism. All of these people are very different. They have different backgrounds. They are from different political parties with different histories. And so it should be evident that maybe it's not the individual who has directed our economic systems, but that the economic systems have directed the individual. Our economic system is contradictory. At a basic level, you've got people who work to make things and you've got the people who own and sell those things. Generally, both of these people want to make more money or improve their place in life, the worker through higher wages and the owner through higher profits. Assuming all else equal, increasing the amount the owner pays in higher wages will necessarily lower their profits, and conversely, lowering the amount in wages will necessarily increase profits. So you've got this contradiction or conflict at the very base of society. One way in which workers found effective at increasing their wages or improving their conditions was forming a group or a union where they all together put their demands to the owner. A worker by themselves is relatively disposable, the owner can just find another one. But when all of their employees unite to stop working, then the enterprise that makes the owner money obviously can't run. These unions get pretty big, and some find that they can unite together under a single political party to represent the interests of all workers in politics broadly, which leads to some pretty big wins for working people. As these unions or the union-affiliated parties become more powerful, achieving greater and greater benefits for their members, the share of profit in the economy started to fall. Falling profit rates occurred for a number of reasons. For one, that growing share of labour, 2, high corporate tax rates and regulations, and 3, the natural tendency for companies to overproduce. Now, instead of trying to rid this contradiction in the economy, like some of the unions actually wanted, left and right-wing governments tolerated this dynamic, seeing themselves as fair and balanced umpires. The left obviously saw itself as a little bit more on the side of workers, and the right a little bit more on the side of employers. However, given in this system, the owner fundamentally has the power over their employees, given they're the owners, they own and direct the economic base, this falling rate of profit and the advancing labour front would at some point come to a head, which it did. May 1968 seemed to set the Western world alight. In France, Italy, Australia, the US, we saw anti-war protests combined and intertwined with organised trade union action. Action more ambitious than before and outside of the confines of the respective Labour parties. Some unions even seized their workplaces and operated entirely without their bosses and their owners. In Australia, for example, we saw 1 million workers go on strike in 1969, largely of their own volition, in protest of the prosecution of the Secretary of the Tramways Union, Larry O'Shea. This era of renewed militancy was one where overt strike action was regularly taken, wage demands grew significantly, which in turn fastened the declining rate of profit for employers, which at first was pretty good for working people. They got good wages, they kept up with inflation, and governments with a new sense of ambition started investing more into social programs. Then there was an oil crisis. The other part of our economic system is one that requires infinite expansion. Part of that is finding the raw resources and cheap labour to do that, which for us Westerners, colonising everywhere else. Long story short, that colonisation left a lot of the now independent former colonies pretty unhappy, and even more unhappy when our governments kept trying to meddle in their affairs. So some Middle Eastern countries decided to block off all oil to the west in an act of protest. Fuel prices skyrocketed, which created severe shortages and inflation. Now, the rate of profit was really in a freefall. Given the government ensures and codifies the economic base of the owner class, even when run by union-affiliated parties, governments began to draw back on the extensive social change promised. In Australia, for example, at the 1975 Australian Labor Party conference, the Prime Minister's economic advisor described it as a business orgy. Around the same time, the Prime Minister has sent in the military twice to crack down on striking workers. So, organised workers had some pretty big wins, and in the ensuing crisis, the owner class clawed some influence back. But this stalemate was unsustainable for both sides. On one hand, wage claims had slowed down, reforms took a back seat, and workers weren't exactly chuffed. On the other hand, the last few wins for workers combined with general global economic instability created a weird moment where businesses couldn't grow but inflation was really high. This was the crisis of social democracy. No amounts of reconciliation or benevolent mediating from governments or hand-waving previous and current imperialism could resolve these contradictions fundamental to our society. So something had to be done. And this is where the owner class took action and where the labour movement faltered. It's helpful to frame these societal shifts and trends in a personalised kind of way, but it's also inaccurate and speaks to the overall problem. Try not to imagine the owner class taking action as a bunch of billionaires smoking cigars in a dark room playing poker, plotting their next move to take over the world. Likewise, try not to imagine the labour movement faltering as a given union resolving at a conference to give up the capital R revolution. What we're looking at is how sections of the population generally act in and react to the conditions around them, and typically, we see actions and reactions along class lines. Typically, people will act in the interest or what they perceive to be the interest of their class, and this is usually seen gradually over months, years, decades, as opposed to individuals getting up and declaring their next move in line with their class position. Society is fluid, it's always moving, and it's complicated. An answer was beginning to emerge in certain sections of the owner class, particularly in the high-profile government bureaucracy, political parties, and peak lobby groups. While previously the owner class may have actually campaigned and wanted things like public schools and hospitals, as these things contribute to an educated and healthy workforce they can use to make and sell products, there was an observable shift in the 70s and 80s towards a partial or complete withdrawal of the government from the economy. They saw the government as large, inefficient, and at fault for the current crisis of profitability. They also saw unions as a key barrier to changing the government, as many of the large and inefficient parts of the government, whether it be public housing, fixed interest, or price caps, were things won or championed by the unions. So the first step was to break the unions. I'm going to focus on Australia because it's where I'm from, I'm most familiar with it, but the general process of confronting and breaking the union movement and subsequently the withdrawal of the government and non-market forces from the economy happened across the world. Most of Australia's unions are affiliated either directly with the Australian Labor Party or affiliated with the Australian Council of Trade Unions, itself intrinsically tied to the party. After being ousted in 1975, the ALP won the 1983 federal election after the Conservative Party was unable to really resolve those problems mentioned earlier. As inflation remained high and growth stagnant, strikes had crept up again, though without that same political flair as the late 60s and early 70s. The leader of the party by this point was Bob Hawke, who was also the former head of the ACTU and instrumental in some of the nationwide strikes of the early 70s. However, as was mentioned before, the ALP wasn't necessarily interested in addressing or resolving the contradictions fundamental to our economy, but rather saw itself as a fair mediator and manager. Because the unions were committed to the party, they had to toe this line, and thus, little in terms of imagination or answers to the unsustainable system was generated. Conversely, employers, bureaucrats, and owners were increasingly eager to usher in this new system where the government was withdrawing from the economy. Thus, the Hawke Labor government campaigned on, once again, reconciliation and mediation, but this time with a very different tone. There was going to be real concessions made on both ends, particularly on the workers' ends, and these were going to be permanent. See, the theory that was making the rounds in the owner class at the time was this idea that if you gave entrepreneurs, investors, and business owners the space and ability, i.e. this idea mentioned of getting the government and the unions out of the economy, then they will be more efficient, productive, and generate more wealth. So inherently in this equation, more power and leeway is given to the owner class, who, by the way, already own the economic base of society. The government had to take a sideline role. It was too slow, it was inefficient, and the unions were too obstructive. This was also a sly little way at restarting the rate of profit, which was a key issue the owner class had with social democracy. Remember, owners want to improve their profits. Regulations, taxes, and union obstruction were all obstacles to higher rates of profit. So, Hawke won in '83, and within the first year the accord was signed between the government, the unions, and the owner class. The basic idea was that the unions must give up their strikes, their industrial action, and their militancy, as these were obstructive to the maintenance of business and the generation of profit. The government will largely get out of the way of businesses and investors, promising sweeping changes to the financial sector, opening completely new markets by selling off government assets and institutions to the highest bidder. In return for giving up their strike power and their moneyed wages, the government will promise workers a social wage, or basically services provided that they otherwise pay for with the wage they get from work. This includes services like Medicare and superannuation. Now, again, because the union leadership was mostly linked to the party, most of the unions fell in line, with a few key exceptions. Those key exceptions, like the Builders Labourers Federation or the Air Pilots Federation, had the military and police sent in on them as punishment for not upholding the consensus agreed upon in the Accord. These unions tried to argue for an alternative vision, yet were drowned out by the overwhelmingly more powerful apathetic unions, employer associations, and owner class. They were deemed obstructive and subsequently dealt with. And we can see that the rate of strikes plummeted after the Accords were signed. We can also see a significant long-term decline in unionisation rates across Australia, which I'd argue is at least a significant contributing factor to the decline in ambition and readiness to tackle issues in society. Unions or organised social movements were, after all, the main forerunners of change in society, whether it be the minimum wage or civil rights. Crucially, we also see the rate of profit beginning to rise again. This is what academic Elizabeth Humphreys called envelopment, whereby it was the unions, the worker organisations, that were at the vanguard of promoting the interests of the employer class. This was the natural evolution of social democracy, trying to reconcile irreconcilable differences in a system predicated upon the profit of one particular class will only give more leeway and power to that particular class, and that's what happens. Now, I'm assuming that you're aware of the multitude of observable consequences of the deregulatory and privatizing period that was the 1980s and 1990s, that you're aware that trickle-down economics is basically not real, as these are discussions beyond the scope of this video, but have been covered extensively elsewhere. But maybe you're someone who likes what the old Labour Party represented. Maybe you're a Greens voter. Maybe you're a part of Labour and would love to see a return to a less market-centric economy, but are pessimistic about the chances and thus justify the Hawke government's neoliberalism as necessary under the circumstances. And I agree, if I were Hawke, I can't say I have the valor or the tenacity to make different decisions. But that's not the point here. Individuals don't shape society. The point isn't to try and moralise each specific decision made by Hawke or Whitlam. It isn't to place blame on Labour for putting progressive lipstick on neoliberalism. It's to understand what system, what society produced these leaders and shaped their choices. What circumstances and class dynamics were responsible for motivating the union movement to protect the growing rate of profit at their expense. Because if we fall into this trap of reverse strongman theory, where we put the weight of history and society on the shoulders of individual leaders, we will make the same mistakes as our parents. There was a reason social democracy died. Pinning that on individual neoliberal leaders as opposed to the fundamental failure of social democracy to manage the unmanageable is falling into the exact same trap your grandparents fell into during the 60s and 70s. A coherent and comprehensive understanding as to why neoliberalism emerged is necessary to then learn how to effectively prefigure a new society free from the conflicts of the current.